Our second reading is from 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in the generous undertaking. I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter I am giving my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. The word of the Lord.
The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark from chapter 5.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet, and he begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. She was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, as she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I may be made well." And immediately her hemorrhages stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd, and he said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before Jesus, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to enter to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord. Mark, the first gospel to be written in probably about the year 80 or 90 of the whole first century. And as it was written very clearly and succinctly. He didn't mince words. So the words he uses are very important. A word that you kept hearing throughout this reading of the gospel was immediately. Immediately, the woman was healed. Immediately, Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched me?" Immediately, the young girl got up after Jesus spoke to her. It tells us something about Mark and the way he writes. It tells us that Mark has something very important to tell us, and he thinks it's so important that he needs to share it right now. And because he needs to share it right now, it's something that you and I need to share right now. It's that important. Immediately, we have to share it. There's an immediacy in his message. But there's also some little clues in the way he talks about 12. 12 years the woman had hemorrhages. The little girl was 12 years of age, representing for us the 12 tribes of Israel in a very symbolic way. So, in other words, telling to us that this was a great disease that affected not only the woman who lay there and probably had to crawl around or stooped over or not much energy at all, probably had to go into the crowds where she was not allowed to be. But as she would go into the crowd, she was affected by not only her own disease, but all the people around her she was not allowed to be with. So she infected the whole community. In other words, this woman who was there, who was having this hemorrhage for 12 years, was an outcast of society. There was no way she would have been allowed there to touch Jesus' clothing. If she did, Jesus should have turned around and said, "Somebody get me some water so I can wash myself." And he would have been unclean until the evening. And yet, he didn't say that. Immediately, he felt power go out of him whenever she touched him. And he turned around and said, "Who touched me?" It's interesting that Jesus does not push away the outcast, even in Mark's gospel. If you remember from last week, when Jesus got in the boat and he traveled to the other side, when Jesus travels to the other side, he's crossing a boundary. He's going across somewhere where no one else will cross. There were no synagogues in the place where he was going across. There were no people that he would have anything to do with. As a matter of fact, there was a very first person he met was a young man who had a demon, several demons. And he cast those demons out of him and put them in the pigs, and they went over the hillside, and then the people decided, we're going to throw Jesus over the hillside as well. Jesus healed the man, and then the people who were content to have that man having his fits every once in a while, they knew how to control him. They knew within their own cultural system what to make him do. He was stuck in that system, and they knew how to work with him, and so they were content with that. And when Jesus changed the world and turned everything upside down, they were upset with him. He got back in the boat, and he went to the other side. And there on the other side, where there are synagogues, where there are people just like him, he finds this man, Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. And Jairus' daughter is sick. She's 12 years of age. Jairus' daughter, caught up within the system, has to be at home, away from everyone else, because anyone who's sick, anyone who hemorrhages, anyone who has any way of infecting the community has to be separated from the community. You cannot be part of community. It's as if all of the people here on this side of the congregation are sick and all of you do not want to be close to them. So at the time of the peace, you would share the peace here and shun all of these people because they're outcast. We don't want to be near them. And I didn't do that because Marcia's sitting over here. I'm kidding, Marcia. But what we do understand is this. Within the community that we have, this happens even within ourselves today. Even within our own community. We have people we shun. We have people that we decide have to go on the outside because they're different than us. People who cannot be in the community because they're unclean. I'm sure you can think of all kinds of different people. Well, they're not like us. Well, they don't look like us. They don't think like us. They don't act like us in any way, shape, or form. They don't eat mashed potatoes with noodles on top. Those kinds of things. And yet, Jesus comes into the midst of the community, and whenever someone is different, is an outcast, and they touch Jesus, they reach out in faith, Jesus says, "You now have a name." This unnamed woman, outcast of the community, unable to buy food, to sell anything, unable to have anything within the community at all. She now has a name, daughter, and healed. Daughter, you are healed. And you know what the interesting thing about this is? We look and we think about these people over here on this side and we say, well, those are the outcast. But then we forget that all but by the grace of Jesus, this side also is outcast. Outcast from God. Because there's nothing within us that could make us good enough to be in the presence of God. So in other words, we are all a community of outcasts who have reached out to Jesus and touched him. And as we reach out and touch Jesus, we realize that's the only thing we can do. That's the only thing left to do because we've tried everything else and it doesn't work. Nothing in our lives works to make us good enough to be in the presence of Jesus. And yet we touch him. And instead of him turning and saying, "You filthy dog, now I have to go clean myself," he turns around and says to us, "Son, daughter, you are healed." It's as if we are each also this young girl who has been lying in bed, who is sick unto death, and she dies, and Jesus comes in and he resurrects her from death. And as he resurrects her from death, he too gives her a name, daughter. The two daughters remind us that you and I are sons and daughters of God, made sons and daughters by the grace of God. And it gives us now the immediacy to go tell that good news that Mark had, See, Mark used that word over and over, and every time we hear that word immediately, we understand immediately that this is good news for us. This is such good news, we have to go share it now. And so this good news for us today, that we are sons and daughters, is such good news that we've got to go share it immediately. So sons and daughters of God, go and share the good news that Jesus has given to you. Go and share the good news that you are healed, you are made whole, you are invited to this meal that we celebrate today, and anyone who reaches out to Jesus in faith is invited to this meal this day. Amen.